Severe floods hit Australia for the third time in 6 weeks. Is the country ready for a changing climate? Global emissions hit their highest levels ever. Do we really still have time to avert climate catastrophe? And the world record-winning sailor cleaning the oceans of plastic. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world, hear from the people being hit hardest by those changes, and report on the race for solutions. Now, we start today in Australia, where rivers have burst their banks after intense rainfall. Hundreds of Sydney residents were forced from their homes today, many for the second time in a month. The city's already received more rainfall in 2022 than it does in a whole year on average. Much of Australia's east coast has been hit by 3 separate intense weather patterns in the past 6 weeks, and entire towns have been submerged in floods. Nicole Johnson reports from Sydney.
Rescue workers try to retrieve a man's body after his van became stuck in rising floodwaters. Another victim of an unprecedented season of rain on Australia's east coast. Camden has been flooded 3 times in a month. Alex Ginn is exhausted from it. This time he lost his shed and almost his life.
The current was so fast, so forceful, it was about to knock me out, and the only thing I could grab was this, and this branch actually saved me. I was holding on to this for my life.
Muddy water has swept through the bowling club again. Volunteers say they've never seen so many floods in such a short period of time.
I have noticed that there's been a change, and in particular the last 3 or 4 months we've had incredible amounts of rainfall, and obviously it's led to what we witnessed last night and this morning.
For the last 3 years, Australia has been hit by extreme weather events. The northern New South Wales town of Lismore has been underwater twice this year. And weeks of rain in Sydney has led to flash floods in streets, homes and businesses. The Nepean River broke its banks, and other major bridges in the city are being closed.
Rain in Sydney is starting to ease, but the river levels are set to rise as this huge volume of water moves downstream, bringing with it the risk of more floods.
And Australia's science agency says global warming is making severe floods more likely. The country's Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, admits Australia has an increasingly challenging environment.
Australia is becoming a harder country to live in because of these natural disasters.
But Gary Goody doesn't agree, even after 3 floods in a month.
Do you blame this on climate change?
Look, I'm a sceptic. I'm sorry. No, I don't. No, I don't. I think it's just a cycle. We go through these cycles.
The polarising issue of climate change in Australia will no doubt play a major role in the upcoming federal election. Nicole Johnston, Sky News, Camden.
The world's climate scientists early this week warned that there's now only a narrow chance of limiting global warming to that crucial 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. In short, the world is burning too many fossil fuels and not doing enough to slow emissions. Well, levels of methane in the atmosphere reached record levels in 2021. That's according to US government scientists. Now, the gas, it's less abundant than carbon dioxide, but it's more powerful and is largely as a result of oil and gas operations. Meanwhile, the concentration of carbon dioxide remains the most important way to measure atmospheric change, and that number is also rising fast. Now, experts say that it's likely to hit 420 parts per million this month. Now, that's not only a modern record, scientists say it's over 4 million years since there was last that much CO2 in the atmosphere. And this chart here gives some more recent historical context. Now, CO2 levels start rising along with the Industrial Revolution. So this vertical line here is around the year 900, when the burning of fossil fuels created a new and warmer world. 1900, that date there. And after that, you can see that the graph takes off. Well, joining me now to tell us more is Dr. Ella Gilbert, who was on the show precisely a year ago when the carbon dioxide levels hit 417 parts per million, to explain why this all matters. So, Ella, welcome to you. So tell us, first of all, what's happening here. What do these charts tell us?
Well, these charts give an idea of how much carbon dioxide is actually in the atmosphere, and that's related to how much the biosphere, so forests and plants, etc., take up, but also, of course, related to our human-caused emissions of CO2.
And why should we worry about this? Why is it a cause for concern?
Well, we know that greenhouse gases like CO2 are causing, or the primary cause of, climate change, and that, of course, brings with it increased temperatures, it brings with it increased risk of extreme events, intensified wildfires, flooding, the exact sort of events that we've been seeing that are hitting Australia right now. It hits the most vulnerable people hardest, and it comes with, things like sea level rise and the whole suite of changes that we have associated with climate change.
And countries around the world are committing to targets to reduce their emissions, to hit net zero. If those goals are met, what would happen to these graphs?
Well, hopefully, the rate of increase would start to slow down. So instead of it being a steep upward climb, it would start to plateau a bit. And then if we manage to bring our kind of negative emissions technologies online, that can be as low tech as planting lots of forest, or as high tech as solutions such as direct air capture, then the curve would start to not just flatten, but also decline. And that's what we need to do to reach net zero, where we have any emissions of carbon dioxide balanced by net removals of carbon dioxide.
Dr. Ella Gilbert, thanks very much indeed. So let's get some of the day's other climate news now. And Tower Bridge was closed to traffic this morning after climate activists abseiled off the sides of the London landmark to unfurl a huge banner protesting the use of fossil fuels. According to the group, the action took place at the root source of fossil fuel funding in the UK, the City of London. The protest comes after 8 days of disruption at oil facilities by Extinction Rebellion and the Just Stop Oil Coalition. A £375 million investment package has been announced to help support the government's new energy strategy. The financial package includes £240 million to fund low-carbon hydrogen production projects and £5 million towards carbon capture and storage. The Prime Minister says the strategy is a long-term plan focusing on nuclear power, offshore wind and hydrogen that will undo the mistakes of the past. And a century-old shark found washed up on a Cornish beach died from meningitis, a post-mortem has found. While it's the first report of meningitis in the species, scientists said it's too early to link the disease to man-made stressors in the environment, such as ocean pollution. The female Greenland shark, found just outside Newlyn Harbour in mid-March, is still considered juvenile by marine biologists, with the species able to live up to 400 years. Now, last month, 175 countries came together in Nairobi to agree a global plastics treaty tackling the pollution crisis along the material's whole supply chain. Now, one day, perhaps, it might have an impact, but for now, the oceans are swimming in the stuff. In our latest climate diary, we meet one world record-holding sailor who's now working on cleaning up the sea.
I'm Yvan Bourgnon, I'm a sailor. I spent half time of my life on the sea. I won Transat Jacques Vabre one time, mini Transat race, and with my son, Mathis, we beat a few records like the Mediterranean crossing record and English Channel crossing record too. During my professional sailing time, I hit 3 times a container, and particularly the last time in 2015, middle of the Atlantic, we hit the container in the night and we break completely the boat in 2 pieces. We have a factory who can convert this plastic to energy. And so after, at the end, we can minimize the footprint carbon of the boat. pollution was not there. In the beginning of the 80s, no plastic at the top of the ocean. When I was young, I had the chance to see these beautiful oceans with no pollution. So yes, it makes sense for me when I come back to do the maximum for to fight this pollution.
Do stay with us. Coming up, I'll be joined by the economist Vicky Pryce and Donica McCarthy, climate columnist for The Independent. And we're going to be discussing what's been a huge week for climate, the UN climate report and the UK's energy security strategy. How do they both affect you?
Well, when the pandemic hit, we shut the doors here and we became a food bank for about 18 months. So when we first shut, it felt a bit silly for us to go home. It felt a bit like running away. So we sent a letter out to the 200 nearest people who lived near us, and we said that we were still here and we were willing to help out. And they got in touch asking for us to fetch prescriptions, walk their dogs, help with food. And then after a little while, the city council heard that we'd done that. And as part of their community hub programme, they asked 27 organisations, of which we were one, to become a kind of network of support. And principally, most of us became food banks. And what we discovered during that time is that people are unbelievably generous, that there is a huge amount of people out there willing to help, willing to donate, willing to volunteer, but that also the problems that we were facing, that we were inheriting, weren't caused because of COVID. COVID had just allowed this moment of solution, allowed all these people to have to be able to give up what they normally do with their time and help out. And so that was a real kind of shock to us. We weren't aware of all of that going on in the background. And we stopped because we ran out of money and because real life came back, and we needed to get on with the jobs that we're paid to do that allowed us the resource to do that. But the problems still face it. I mean, fuel poverty was a huge problem 2 years ago, and I have no idea how hard it's going to be now. And here I'm sat in the theatre at the minute, and we had an event to celebrate all the community hubs. The community hub programme was coming to an end. All those people that had sort of jumped on and tried to help out in the moment of crisis were going back to their everyday jobs. And that means that support mechanism that was there, which was already a kind of emergency support mechanism, isn't there. So we're dealing with a problem that existed beforehand that got worse because of COVID, that is now getting worse because of all sorts of pressures and tensions. But the resilience isn't there. The people who were a bit hit hard in the beginning, they've just been malleted for the last 2 years. And I think that collectively as a society, we need to wake up and go, we need some extraordinary measures to try and help alleviate some of the pressure that people are under. Our mission is to ensure that the people of Holbach have the best possible cultural life. And that is about being really good at our jobs, about making theatre, making sure the piano sounds good and all that stuff that you would expect. But if they're too hungry to leave their house, or they don't know how to heat their house, then they can't come out and be our audience. And it strikes me that we are as invested in the whole of our community as we are in our ability to entertain them.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with the economist Vicky Pryce and Donica McCarthy, climate columnist for The Independent. So good to see you both. Good evening. So, on Monday, we had the UN's panel of climate change experts issue their latest report. The UN Secretary-General said investing in new fossil fuels was moral and economic madness, and he called countries who do so dangerous radicals. Then yesterday, the UK government published its new energy strategy, and in it, they cleared the way for another licensing round for oil and gas companies to drill for more. So, Vicky, the question then is the government full of dangerous radicals allowing North Sea oil and gas drilling to go ahead?
I think it was always known that gas had a role to play in the energy transition, but what has happened, of course, in between COP26 and now is that we have the war in the Ukraine and everyone is worried about energy security. So that has come up on the agenda. And I think right now it's almost eclipsing net zero, I'm afraid. But what we're talking about, of course, is just ensuring that there is more domestic production, which can meet some of the demands that we have. We would have had to import a lot of gas anyway, and for some time to come. So it's not as if we are doing something major and one that can be, if you like, categorized the way that has been done by the UN. But it is a reaction to the fact that the world probably still needs quite a lot of gas. Prices would have gone up even more if one didn't have enough ability to switch to other gas areas that can produce sufficiently to make up for what we may be losing as a world from Russia. So it makes sense, I think, in the short term, but of course only as a short-term measure.
OK, Donica, I noticed you were shaking your head there, but I mean, the government would say it's logical to replace the oil and gas that we're giving up from Russia with domestically produced oil and gas, and they say it's not going to affect our climate targets. But you're shaking your head. What do you think?
Well, to actually have the UK government holds the presidency of the United Nations Climate Conference. The UN has clearly said any new oil and gas is criminal and will destroy our hopes of net zero. So what the UK government did yesterday is it gave a message to every country in the world, to, in the words of the government minister, exploit every drop of oil and gas that you want to. That means suicide for humanity, and it's absolutely disgraceful. And in the words of the UN General Secretary, it is criminal arson.
Vicky, do you want to pick up on that? I mean, we are still presidents of COP26, aren't we? And we're trying to persuade the big polluters of the world to give up fossil fuel. So is this setting a bad example?
I think right now we're in a bind because of the concern about energy security, as I was saying earlier. I mean, the same Prime Minister went to Saudi Arabia to try and get more oil pumped from the ground. So it is a strange environment we're in right now. It's a little bit like reacting in a certain way when we had COVID. So it is an emergency. So we need to look at that as a transition we may be going through, where indeed we may be relying a lot more on fossil fuels in the short term, or looking at how that security can be provided by that. Of course, if you look at the energy strategy, it includes loads of plans in terms of moving to a lot more renewables and faster than perhaps had been assumed originally, and with a lot of money being spent, just as you said earlier in your summary.
Donica?
Well, what the government did yesterday was it announced that it was moving towards more fracking, more North Sea oil, more nuclear, none of which will bring down our carbon emissions by 2030. Nuclear might deliver by 2040, 2050, but the UN said clearly we're in a crisis if we don't cut our emissions by 50% by 2030. The UN IPCC report this week stated that we're looking at a 14% increase when we should have 50% decrease. What Vicky is expressing there is traditional Treasury thinking. The economics that got us into this mess, the economists that failed for 50 years to prepare for the crisis of Ukraine and to prepare for the crisis of climate. We've got to move away from these economists that got us into this lethal existential threat.
Vicky, do you want to defend economists there?
Well, what can I say? It was actually an economist, Nick Stern, under whom I worked, Lord Stern now, who did the first climate change report, where he put the economics on top of the science and really got everyone to realize that we had to act quite quickly, and that the cost of not doing so and leaving it to later would be enormous. So I think economists have played a very important, very significant part in explaining what the science was implying in terms of why we needed to act.
Let's look at the strategy a bit more closely, Donica. Oh, go on. What are you going to say?
It's the government economists have failed us, not Lord Stern. It's the government economists in the Treasury have failed us for the last 15 years. They refused to invest in renewables. They refused to invest in insulation. They refused to invest in energy efficiency. And that means millions of people in UK homes this winter will be cold and hungry. It's a disgrace and a failure by our economic system and our government.
I'm sorry. I have to make a small correction, if I may. When Nick Stern produced his report, he was a government economist. He was head of the Government Economic Service, and I was his deputy. And then I took over from him jointly with someone else. So he was doing it as a government economist, and he was taken very seriously at the time, and it continues to be taken seriously.
Donica, on the subject, I'm just going to move us on to the more broad point about the energy security strategy, because the government would say that it includes a goal of 95% renewables by 2030. I mean, that's very much in keeping with the IPCC report, isn't it? Which says that we have to peak our emissions in just 3 years' time and then decline by nearly half by 2030. I mean, doesn't the government strategy fit in with that?
Well, what's confusing about the government strategy is it says it will reach us 95% renewables, but actually it's putting all the money into nuclear. So how do the two square up with each other?
Would
nuclear
they not
can't
say that
deliver by
nuclear is
2030.
zero emissions,
It's impossible.
zero CO2 emissions?
You cannot build nuclear power stations by 2030 to bring down carbon emissions as required. It cannot be achieved. And so that's why the government announced yesterday that nuclear would be safe, and cheap. It's actually eye-wateringly expensive. Even one government minister that France, which was about the only country in the world that went down that route, that the costs are just mind-boggling. You're talking about maybe up to £200 billion, and it would take 20 years. If we invest in energy storage, solar, and onshore wind, we can bring this costs down, and we could cut our carbon emissions in the next 3 to 5 years. That would eliminate needs for any imports from Russia and neighbouring European countries.
Vicky, do you think that's a fair point? I mean, obviously this is a broad strategy. It's not just nuclear, as Donncha was hinting there. There's also a lot of offshore wind. But do you think more could have been done on solar and onshore wind that would have had quicker results?
I think yes, I have to say that I agree with that. And also I agree that nuclear may not be the answer. It takes a long time for anything to be built, and we know full well the costs keep going up. And then there are faults, and the time scale is really quite long. And we've seen that happen all across the world, and that's a real problem. But I think if you're looking at the hundreds of billions, if you like, that have just been mentioned may need to be spent on nuclear at some, over a period of time, we could certainly have spent a lot more on energy efficiency. And one of the gaps that we still have is the whole insulation. What happens at the domestic front, given that we have such an old housing stock. So I think in terms of looking at where the emphasis is in this energy strategy, I think it's the wrong way. I don't have anything against nuclear, and we know that the taxonomy overall, we know that the taxonomy that the EU has produced now includes nuclear and gas as part of clean, in inverted commas, that I know that not everyone agrees with, but that's how the world is moving. So nuclear may well play a part, but I think in terms of speed, doing more on renewables would have been considerably better, or on energy efficiency, on energy efficiency.
A quick word on energy efficiency, Donncha. I imagine that you agree with Vicky. I've heard a lot of people saying that was a miss from this strategy. Are you one of them?
Absolutely. I mean, thankfully, there's significant consensus everywhere except maybe in government and in the major papers that this is the right thing to do. There's around 9 million people who would have had their homes insulated by now if the government hadn't slashed the insulation programme in 2012. And yesterday, the Chancellor refused to put a penny more into that programme, which is mind-boggling. He's flown off to California and left people high and dry in the UK with expensive bills. Yesterday's programme will not reduce bills by 1 penny, when he could have invested in onshore wind, in insulation for homes and storage, and that will bring people's bills down. And that's what we need. Bring the bills down and cut carbon emissions, a win-win.
OK, and very briefly, each of you, how quickly are we going to see cheaper bills from greener sources? Vicky, very briefly.
Well, greener sources are cheaper, I have to admit to that, but it's going to take quite some time. And what I worry about is that in the meantime, with bills being so high, people may be turned off, sort of net zero, if you like, and really care much more at anything, including whether it's gas or oil or any way of getting more and cheaper energy in order for this cost of living crisis to be over faster. So I worry, frankly, about
Donncha, do you have the same concerns that climate concerns will go off people's agenda because they're more worried about affordability?
Well, I think actually what's really interesting now compared to 10 years ago is affordability and cutting carbon are on the same page. It's actually fossil fuels and nuclear are eye-wateringly expensive and don't address the climate change fast enough. So we should be in a win-win. That's what's mind-boggling about what the Chancellor is doing. He could have cut bills and cut carbon emissions. He's done the opposite.
OK, I'm wrapping you up because we're out of time. But Donncha and Vicky, very good to see you both. Interesting to hear your views. Thank you both. So thanks for watching. We're out of time, but I'll see you next time.